I lost everything in 2008. That's when my marriage changed. Section 1. The year being careful became a mistake. I remember the exact moment the air left the room. It wasn't a loud bang or a dramatic crash on the trading floor. It was the sound of 1,000 sighs happening at once across lower Manhattan. My name is Thomas Caldwell, and in the summer of 2008, I believed that logic was a shield. I had spent 15 years building a life on the foundation of calculated risks and steady growth. I had the house in Greenwich, the respected title, and a marriage that felt like a sanctuary. But as the tickers turned red and stayed red, I realized that my caution had been my greatest vulnerability. I had played the game by the rules, only to watch the board be flipped by people who didn't even know my name. The initial decline was deceptive, like a slow tide pulling away from the shore before a tsunami hits. I told Rebecca everything would be fine, and for a few weeks, I actually believed it. We sat on our leather sofa, sipping wine that cost more than a mechanic's weekly salary, discussing summer plans. I saw the first flicker of doubt in her eyes when I mentioned we might need to defer the kitchen renovation. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight tightening of her jaw. She didn't ask about the markets. She asked if the neighbors would notice the delay. That was the first time I felt the weight of her expectations pressing against my ribs. By October, the flicker had become a steady flame of anxiety that burned through our dinner conversations. I spent 18 hours a day at the office, watching portfolios evaporate like mist in the morning sun. My colleagues, men I had known for a decade, were carrying their lives out in cardboard boxes. I stayed, fighting for every scrap of equity, trying to salvage a future that was dissolving in real time. I realized that my identity was tied to a number on a screen, and as that number plummeted, I felt myself vanishing. When I came home, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, and increasingly judgmental. I stayed silent because I didn't have the words to explain a systemic collapse to someone who viewed financial stability as a birthright. Rebecca's father had been a successful architect, and she had never known a month where the bills weren't paid by an automated system. To her, my failure wasn't a result of a global crisis. It was a personal betrayal of the contract we had signed at the altar. I watched her look at me across the breakfast table, and for the first time, I didn't see love. I saw an investor looking at a devalued asset. That was the moment I understood that our partnership was built on the height of my pedestal, not the depth of our connection. The social invitations began to dry up, or worse, they became acts of charity. Evan Marshall, a man I had once mentored, called to check in, his voice dripping with a pity that felt like a physical insult. He had moved his assets into shorts months ago, profiting from the very carnage that was leveling my life. When we went to dinner with him and Linda, I could feel Rebecca's humiliation. She didn't look at Evan. She looked at me, her eyes tracking every nervous twitch of my hands. I realized then that she wasn't mourning our lost wealth. She was mourning the status she wore like a second skin. The pressure was no longer about the money. It was about the shame of being seen with a loser. I remember standing in my home office, staring at a liquidity report that confirmed I was effectively wiped out. The house was quiet, but I could hear the phantom sounds of the life we used to lead. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. I had lost the money, yes, but I was also losing the version of myself that Rebecca loved. If the foundation was gone, what was left of the structure? I walked into the bedroom and found her staring out the window. She didn't turn around. She asked me, in a voice as cold as a winter morgue, if we were going to lose the house. I told her I was doing everything I could. She finally turned, her face a mask of disappointment. "Is that supposed to be enough, Thomas?" she asked. The realization hit me that I was alone in my own home. My wife wasn't my partner in this storm. She was a passenger blaming the captain for the weather. I felt the first crack in my devotion, a tiny fissure that would eventually become a canyon. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my record. I simply nodded and walked out. I understood that from this point forward, every word I spoke would be used against me in the court of her respect. I had to become a ghost in my own life to survive the transition. The man who had provided everything was gone, and I needed to see who would emerge from the wreckage. I began to sell what I could, quietly, without asking for her permission or input. The watches, the car I rarely drove, the memberships that were now just reminders of my fall. Each sale was a small victory in a losing war. Rebecca watched these subtractions with a grim, silent intensity. She didn't offer to help. She didn't suggest ways to cut back. She simply retreated into a cold, polite distance. We were living in a mansion that had become a mausoleum of our shared history. I realized that the true test of a man isn't how he handles success, but how he handles the silence of those who only loved him for it. The psychological pressure was a constant hum in my ears. At the grocery store, I found myself calculating the cost of milk, a task I hadn't performed in 20 years. Every small purchase felt like a confession of weakness. I saw the way the clerks looked at me, or rather, the way they didn't. I was becoming invisible to the world I had once commanded. But inside that invisibility, I found a strange kind of freedom. There were no more pretenses to maintain. I was at the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. I just didn't know yet if Rebecca was going to stay at the bottom with me or if she was already looking for a ladder out. One evening, I found her looking at real estate listings in a neighborhood that was a significant step down from our current life. She didn't hide the screen when I walked in. She looked at me with a defiant, weary expression. "We need to be realistic, Thomas," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite name. Not anger, but a cold, hard resolve. I realized she had already moved on from the us that had money. She was preparing for a life where I was a burden to be managed. I looked at her and wondered if she knew that once a person shows you they don't believe in you, you never truly see them the same way again. Section 2. Money changes the tone of love. The move to the smaller house was a funeral for our marriage, though neither of us would admit it at the time. It was a modest colonial on a quiet street, a place where people lived who didn't care about the closing price of Goldman Sachs. For Rebecca, it was a prison. Every box she unpacked was a physical manifestation of my failure. She moved through the rooms like a shadow, her silence louder than any screaming match we could have had. I realized then that her love had been a luxury good, something that required a certain level of maintenance to function. Without the fuel of status, the engine had simply seized up. I found work at a small boutique firm, a significant demotion in both prestige and pay. My office was a fraction of the size of my old one, and my team was a single intern who looked at me like a relic of a bygone era. I didn't mind. I needed a place to think, a place to rebuild the fortress of my mind. I spent my nights reading, studying the new landscape of a broken economy. I was learning a new language, one that didn't rely on the old tricks of the trade. But at home, the language was always the same: disappointment. Rebecca had taken a part-time job at a gallery, not for the money, she claimed, but to stay connected. I knew the truth. She wanted to be around people who still had what I had lost. Dinner became a ritual of endurance. We sat across from each other, the sound of silverware on plates, the only music. She would talk about the people she saw at the gallery, the Marshalls, the Lawsons, and their latest acquisitions. It was a subtle form of torture, a reminder of the circle I had been expelled from. I stayed silent because any defense would sound like an excuse. I was waiting for her to ask me how I was doing, how the new job was, but the questions never came. She had stopped investing in my future because she no longer saw a return on her emotional capital. That was the moment I understood that love, for some, is an equity trade. The shift in our power dynamic was absolute. Because I was no longer the provider of the lifestyle she desired, I no longer held a vote in the household. She made decisions without consulting me, from the brands of food we bought to the way we spent our weekends. It was as if I had become a boarder in my own life. I watched her, observing the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. There was a flickering of pity mixed with a deep-seated resentment. I realized that she blamed me for her reduced life, as if I had personally orchestrated the collapse of the global banking system just to spite her. One night, Evan and Linda invited us to a small gathering. I wanted to decline to stay in my sanctuary of books and spreadsheets, but Rebecca insisted. She needed the fix of that world, even if it was as a guest of honor in the pity category. The evening was exactly as I expected. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of people who had survived the storm with their hulls intact. Evan took me aside, offering me advice that was really just a way to highlight his own brilliance. I listened, my face a mask of polite indifference. I wasn't the man I was a year ago. I was something colder, something more disciplined. I watched Rebecca across the room. She was laughing with Linda, but her eyes were darting around, gauging the reactions of the others. She was trying so hard to belong, to show that she hadn't changed, even if her circumstances had. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. I felt a sharp, clean pain in my chest. She was ashamed of me, not because of who I was, but because of what I represented, the possibility of loss. To her, I was a walking memento mori, a reminder that the gilded life is fragile. I realized that my presence was an embarrassment to her, a stain on the image she was desperately trying to maintain. On the drive home, she was silent for a long time. Then, without looking at me, she said, "Evan said there might be an opening at his firm in the spring. You should call him." It wasn't an encouraging suggestion. It was a command born of desperation. She wanted her old life back, and she didn't care if I had to crawl to a man I despised to get it. I felt the rising psychological pressure of her expectations. She didn't want Thomas the man. She wanted Thomas the ATM. I realized that if I did what she asked, I would be signing away the last of my dignity. I stayed silent, the city lights blurring past the window. I began to wake up at 4:30 a.m., working on a private strategy, a way to navigate the new volatility of the markets. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone. This was my private rebellion, a slow burn reconstruction of my sovereignty. I was operating in the shadows of my own life, building a foundation that she couldn't see and therefore couldn't judge. I felt a sense of quiet power growing within me. The less she knew, the less she could influence. I was becoming a ghost to her, and she was becoming a stranger to me. We were two people sharing a bed but living in different universes. The social imbalance was now a permanent fixture of our existence. She started spending more time with her old friends, often staying out late and coming home with the smell of expensive gin on her breath. She didn't offer explanations, and I didn't ask for them. I was busy. I was focused. I was learning how to wait. I understood that timing is everything, not just in the markets, but in life. The pressure was building, a silent tension that filled the house like gas. One spark would set it off, but I was determined not to be the one to strike the match. I was waiting for the moment when the mask would finally slip. The moment came on a Tuesday evening in late November. I was in my office staring at a set of projections that finally showed a path back to significant capital. The door opened, and Rebecca stood there, her face flushed with a mixture of wine and anger. She had been at a dinner I wasn't invited to. She looked at my modest desk, my old laptop, and the stacks of papers. "How much longer are we going to live like this, Thomas?" she demanded. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the house. I looked up at her, and for the first time in months, I really looked at her. I didn't see my wife. I saw a woman who was already gone. I realized then that I had been fighting to save a marriage that had died the moment my bank account hit zero. I didn't answer her. I just turned back to my screen, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Section 3. I became a risk she didn't want to carry. The silence in the house became a physical entity, a third person living in the rooms we shared. After that Tuesday night, Rebecca stopped asking about my work altogether. It was as if she had mentally categorized me as a permanent loss, a bad investment she had to tolerate until the lease on her patience finally expired. I watched her move through our smaller life with a polished, icy detachment. She began taking more consulting trips for the gallery, weekends spent in the city or the Hamptons with people whose fortunes had remained untouched by the crisis. I didn't ask for details, and she didn't offer them. I stayed silent because the truth was already written in the way she avoided my gaze. I realized that I had become a risk she simply didn't want to carry on her personal balance sheet anymore. In the world we used to inhabit, a husband's career was the primary asset, and mine had gone into default. To Rebecca, my struggle wasn't a testament to my character, it was a flaw in the product. I spent my nights in my small home office, the glow of the monitors, the only light in the room. I was tracking the movement of distressed assets, finding the patterns in the wreckage that others were too panicked to see. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I was no longer playing to maintain a lifestyle for a woman who didn't respect the man behind it. I was playing for my own survival. The psychological pressure at home shifted from active resentment to a terrifying kind of indifference. It is one thing to be yelled at, it is another to be ignored as if you are already a ghost. I would come into the kitchen for coffee, and she would walk past me as if I were a piece of furniture she was planning to replace. I understood that she was waiting for me to break, to admit defeat, or to provide her with a reason to leave that wouldn't damage her own social standing. She wanted to be the victim of a failed man, not the woman who walked away when things got difficult. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I remained calm, disciplined, and utterly focused. I stayed silent because I was building a fortress she couldn't see. While she was out maintaining appearances with people like Evan Marshall, I was making small surgical moves in the market. I wasn't swinging for the fences yet. I was bunting, moving the runners, accumulating small wins that stayed hidden in accounts she didn't know existed. I felt like a spy in my own home. I watched her check her reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting her expensive coat, one of the few things she hadn't sold, and I realized she was dressing for a world I no longer belonged to. That was the moment I understood that our paths hadn't just diverged, they were moving in opposite directions. One afternoon, I found a legal folder tucked under a stack of magazines on the dining table. It wasn't hidden well, which I suspected was intentional. It was a preliminary consultation document from a high-end family law firm in the city. She hadn't signed anything, but the intent was there, laid out in cold black ink. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not of fear, but of confirmation. The risk I posed to her lifestyle was finally outweighing the history we shared. I didn't confront her. I didn't move the folder. I simply walked into my office and doubled my efforts. The clock was ticking, and I needed to ensure that when the split finally happened, I wasn't the one left in the cold. The status threat was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. I saw Evan Marshall at a local coffee shop a few days later. He looked at my worn shoes and my older model car with a smirk that he didn't even try to hide. "Still grinding away, Tom? You know there's no shame in admitting the game has changed," he said, his voice loud enough for the other patrons to hear. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel the sting of humiliation. I felt a profound sense of pity for him. He was still defined by the noise of the market, while I had found the power in the silence. I thanked him for his concern and walked away without looking back. I realized that my endurance was becoming my greatest asset. While Rebecca searched for an exit strategy, I was perfecting a re-entry strategy. I began to see the first signs of the market's recovery, a slow pulse returning to the economy. My private accounts began to swell, the numbers finally reflecting the months of sleepless nights and rigorous analysis. But I kept the news to myself. I continued to drive the old car, to wear the same 3 suits, and to live in the shadow of her disappointment. I wanted to see exactly how far her loyalty would stretch before it snapped. I was testing the limits of her conditional love. The pressure at home reached a boiling point during a quiet dinner in February. The heating system in the house had failed, and the air was freezing. We were both wearing sweaters, sitting in a room that felt more like a bunker than a dining room. Rebecca dropped her fork, the sound echoing off the bare walls. "I can't do this anymore, Thomas. This isn't a life. It's a waiting room," she said. Her voice was trembling, not with sadness, but with a pure, unadulterated fury. I looked at her, my expression neutral. I realized she was waiting for me to apologize, to beg for more time, or to promise her the world. I did none of those things. "I understand," I said quietly. That was all. I didn't offer a defense. I didn't mention the accounts that were finally turning green. I watched the confusion flicker across her face, followed quickly by a cold, hard mask of resolve. She had expected a fight, a chance to justify the folder on the table. By remaining calm, I had robbed her of the narrative of the struggling, desperate husband. I stayed silent because my words no longer had any value in her currency. We finished the meal in a silence that was so heavy it felt like it would collapse the house around us. That night, I slept on the sofa in my office. I stared at the monitors, watching the global markets breathe in and out. I felt a strange sense of peace. The worst had already happened. The betrayal was confirmed, the humiliation was public, and the woman I had loved had revealed the price tag on her devotion. I was finally free of the burden of her expectations. I realized that the only thing left to do was to wait for the right moment to step back into the light. But when I did, I would be doing it alone. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would succeed, but what I would do with that success once she realized it was back. Section 4. Failure is loud at home, quiet everywhere else. Living as a failure in the eyes of your spouse is a specific kind of hell. It's not a sudden heat. It's a slow, numbing cold that starts in your bones and works its way out. Everywhere else, the world was moving on. People were starting to talk about the bottom being behind us. In the city, the frantic energy of the crash was being replaced by a cautious, predatory optimism. But inside our 4 walls, the crash was a permanent state of being. Rebecca had stopped hiding her disdain. She spoke to me in short, clipped sentences, the kind you use with a servant who has consistently disappointed you. I realized that to her, my lack of immediate recovery was a choice, a sign of a broken will. I became an expert at the art of invisibility. I learned how to move through the house without leaving a footprint, how to eat without making a sound, and how to exist without demanding any space. Failure is loud at home because every sigh, every look, and every unpaid luxury bill is a scream. Outside, however, I was a ghost. I spent my days in the public library or in the back of quiet cafes working on my private fund. I was managing a small pool of capital for a few former clients who still trusted my brain more than the headlines. They were my secret lifeline, the only people who knew I wasn't dead, just submerged. The rising psychological pressure came from the constant comparison. Rebecca began talking about Peter Lawson, a senior partner at a rival firm who had somehow managed to double his net worth during the crisis. She praised his vision and his strength. Her words pointed like daggers at my chest. She was no longer just mourning our old life, she was auditioning for a new one. I stayed silent because I knew Peter Lawson. I knew his vision was mostly luck and a high tolerance for unethical behavior. But I didn't defend myself. I let her believe I was less than him. I realized that her perception of me was a mirror of her own values, and I didn't like what I saw. I stayed silent because I wanted to see the full extent of her character. If I had revealed my progress, she might have pivoted back to the supportive wife role. I needed to know if she could love the man without the ledger. The answer was becoming clearer every day. One evening, I came home to find her dressed for a gala. She looked stunning, a ghost of the woman I had married. She didn't ask me to go. She didn't even tell me where she was going. She just walked out the door, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway like a taunt. I realized that she was already living a life that didn't include me. I was just the man holding the leash on her temporary discomfort. I felt a quiet power growing in my chest, a cold ember that refused to go out. Every time she looked through me, every time she checked her phone and smiled at a message she didn't share, the ember burned a little brighter. I was no longer hurt by her betrayal. I was fueled by it. I realized that the 2008 crisis hadn't destroyed my life. It had audited it. It had shown me exactly what was real and what was merely a performance. My money was gone, but so was the illusion of a partnership. I was starting to see the true terms of our marriage, and they were far more expensive than any market loss. I began to document everything, not out of a desire for revenge, but for the sake of clarity. I kept a journal of our interactions, the dates she stayed out late, the way she spoke about our future, or lack thereof. I wanted a record of the silence. I understood that when the time came to rebuild, I would need to remember exactly why I was doing it. The social imbalance was now a chasm. I was the man in the basement, and she was the woman on the way up. Or so she thought. I watched her from the shadows, a silent observer of her slow-motion exit from our life. The pressure intensified when Peter Lawson actually called me. He offered me a job, a mid-level analyst position that was an insult to my experience. He spoke to me with a condescending warmth, the way you speak to a stray dog you're thinking about feeding. I knew Rebecca had talked to him. I knew this was her attempt to fix me so she wouldn't have to be ashamed of me anymore. I thanked him for the offer and told him I'd think about it. When I told Rebecca I was declining, she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just looked at me with a profound, soul-deep disgust. "Then you've truly become a nobody, Thomas," she said. That was the moment I understood that the woman I had married was a stranger. She didn't want a husband who was rebuilding with integrity. She wanted a man who would accept a collar if it meant a steady paycheck. I realized that her respect was something that could be bought, and I was no longer interested in the transaction. I stayed silent, watching her walk away. I felt a strange sense of victory. I had reached the bottom of her regard, and I was still standing. The pressure had peaked, and instead of crushing me, it had turned my resolve into something as hard as a diamond. I spent the next month in a state of hyper-focus. The market was finally starting to reward my patience. The distressed assets I had been tracking were beginning to appreciate. My small group of investors was seeing returns that defied the general market sentiment. I was no longer a ghost. I was a force, albeit a hidden one. I started to look for a new office space, somewhere small and discreet. I was preparing for the quiet power shift that was mentioned in my internal map. I didn't need a penthouse on Park Avenue. I needed a room where I could work without the sound of her judgment in the background. One night, as I was working late, I saw a notification on our shared computer. It was a booking for a hotel in the city under a name I didn't recognize, but the credit card was hers. The realization hit me like a physical blow, yet it didn't break me. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The betrayal wasn't just financial or emotional anymore, it was literal. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the screen illuminating my face. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an architect who had just found the last structural flaw in a building he was about to demolish. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence, a quiet smile forming on my lips. The game was finally reaching its most interesting phase. Section 5. Rebuilding without applause. The process of rebuilding my life felt like working in a cathedral at night. The progress was immense, but the world only saw the dark exterior. I secured a small, windowless office in a nondescript building in Stamford. It smelled of industrial carpet and old coffee, a far cry from the mahogany-lined suites of my previous life. I loved it. There were no distractions, no pitying glances, and, most importantly, no Rebecca. I spent 14 hours a day there, navigating the choppy waters of the post-crisis economy. I was no longer chasing the broad market. I was hunting for specific, undervalued opportunities that the giants were too bloated to notice. I stayed silent because I realized that the loudest successes are often the most fragile. My investors were happy, but I told them to keep my involvement quiet. I didn't want the noise of a comeback story yet. I wanted the cold, hard weight of capital behind me before I stepped back into the ring. At home, I maintained the persona of the struggling, defeated husband. I continued to wear my frayed shirts and drive the car that groaned every time I turned the key. It was a social experiment I hadn't intended to run, but the results were fascinating. I was discovering exactly who stayed when the music stopped. The internal monologue in my head was a constant loop of strategic planning. I realized that my previous success had been built on a system I didn't fully control, but this new growth was entirely mine. Every dollar I earned was a brick in a wall that Rebecca could never climb. I watched her from across the dinner table, noticing how she looked at her phone with a secret, frantic energy. I knew about the hotel bookings. I knew about the meetings that lasted until 2000 a.m. I felt a strange, detached curiosity. It was as if I was watching a movie of someone else's life. The man she was cheating with, whoever he was only buying a version of her that was already rotting from the inside. The rising psychological pressure came from the duality of my existence. In the morning, I was a shark, making moves that netted more in a day than I used to make in a year. In the evening, I was a failure, enduring the silent treatment and the cold meals. I stayed silent because the contrast gave me a perspective I'd never had. I was learning the difference between status and power. Status is what Rebecca craved, the appearance of being important. Power is what I was accumulating, the ability to act without needing anyone's permission. I realized that she was becoming a prisoner of her own desire for status, while I was becoming truly free. One evening, Michelle Grant, an old acquaintance who had always been more observant than the others, stopped me at the local market. She looked at my tired eyes and my plain clothes, but she didn't look at me with pity. "You have the look of a man who's waiting for something, Thomas," she said softly. "I didn't confirm or deny it. I just smiled and moved on." It was a reminder that while Rebecca was blinded by her own disappointment, the rest of the world wasn't entirely oblivious. I felt a surge of confidence. My competence was returning, and with it, a sense of timing that felt almost supernatural. I began to move my assets into more permanent structures, trusts and holdings that were shielded from the immediate reach of a divorce settlement. I wasn't being cruel, I was being realistic. The folder I had found on the table months ago was my guide. If she wanted a life without the risk of Thomas Caldwell, I was going to ensure she got exactly what she asked for. I watched her pack for another gallery trip, her movements efficient and devoid of any guilt. She didn't even look at me as she left. I realized that I didn't hate her, I just didn't care anymore. The emotional tether had finally snapped. The social imbalance reached a peak when we were invited to a charity auction, an event we had once chaired. Rebecca wanted to go, likely to see her new circle in a setting that validated them. I agreed to go, but I told her I couldn't afford a new tuxedo. I wore my old one, which was slightly loose now that I'd lost weight from the stress and the long hours. We arrived, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old money and new desperation. People looked through me as if I were a ghost. I stood in the corner with a glass of cheap sparkling water, watching the theater of it all. I saw Peter Lawson holding court near the stage. He looked at me and gave a mocking toast from across the room. Rebecca was standing near him, laughing at something he said. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. I felt the pressure of 100 judgmental eyes, but I didn't flinch. I stayed silent because I knew something they didn't. I knew that the firm Peter was so proud of was heavily leveraged in a sector that was about to collapse. I had seen the data that morning. I realized that the people in this room were celebrating on the deck of a sinking ship, and I was the only one who had already built a lifeboat. The cliffhanger came at the end of the night. As we were leaving, a man I hadn't seen in years, a high-level institutional investor, approached me. He ignored Peter and the others, walking straight to me. He shook my hand with a grip that felt like a contract. "I hear you're the one to talk to about the new volatility models, Tom. We should have lunch," he said loudly. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw Rebecca's head snap toward us, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sudden, predatory interest. I looked at her, then back at the man, and I gave the slightest nod. I realized the invisible shift had just become visible. Section 6. Success returns before respect does. The lunch with the investor was the catalyst that brought the shadow version of my life into the light. Within weeks, my boutique firm went from a secret project to a whispered about powerhouse. I moved out of the Stamford office and into a sleek, minimalist space in the city. I didn't tell Rebecca. I continued to leave the house at the same time, wearing the same tired clothes, but I changed in the locker room of my new gym. I was living a double life, not for the thrill of the lie, but to maintain the purity of the test. I wanted to see if she would ever offer a kind word without the incentive of my bank account. The internal monologue was focused on the irony of my situation. I was wealthier now than I had been in 2007, but I was living in a home that felt like a hostile embassy. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far her betrayal would go. She had started talking about finding herself and needing space. I knew what those phrases meant. They were the linguistic markers of a woman preparing to jump to a higher branch. I watched her, wondering if she would have the courage to leave before she knew I was back on top, or if she was waiting for a guaranteed landing. The psychological pressure shifted. Now, it was Rebecca who seemed restless. She could sense a change in my energy, even if she couldn't pinpoint the source. I was no longer the man who slumped his shoulders at the dinner table. I walked with a quiet authority that she couldn't explain. I saw her watching me, her eyes narrow with suspicion. "You seem different," she said one evening, her voice hovering between a question and an accusation. I told her I was just getting more sleep. I realized that the truth was the one thing I couldn't give her, because the truth would ruin the clarity of my exit. Success returns before respect does. It's a bitter lesson. Even as my name began to circulate in the right circles again, the people who had seen me fall were slow to adjust their narrative. I went to a business dinner where Evan Marshall was present. He tried to talk over me, to dismiss my points with the same condescension he'd used for years. But this time, the room didn't follow his lead. They listened to me. I spoke with a calm, restrained competence that made his bravado look like the insecurity it was. I realized that respect isn't given, it's earned through the refusal to demand it. I stayed silent about my growing portfolio at home, even as I began to replace the things I had sold. I didn't buy a new car, I bought the debt on the building where Rebecca's gallery was located. I didn't buy a new watch, I bought the private equity firm that was eyeing Evan's company for a hostile takeover. I was moving the pieces on a board she didn't even know existed. I felt a sense of quiet dominance that was far more satisfying than any public gloating. I was the architect of her world now, and she was still treating me like a tenant who was behind on the rent. The social imbalance was now entirely in my favor, though it remained hidden. Rebecca's gallery trips became more frequent, and her excuses thinner. She was spending more time with Peter Lawson, a man whose public image was starting to fray as his firm's losses mounted. I watched this with a cold, analytical detachment. I realized that she was hitching her wagon to a falling star, blinded by the very status she thought would save her. I stayed silent because I wanted her to make her choice based on the version of me she thought was a failure. That was the only way to know the truth of her heart. One night, I came home to find her sitting in the dark, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, there was no disdain in her eyes, only a weary, hollow desperation. "Peter's firm is in trouble," she said, her voice a whisper. I didn't ask how she knew or why it mattered to her. I just nodded. She looked at me, waiting for me to say something, to offer comfort or a solution. I stayed silent. I realized that she was trying to use me as a sounding board for her anxiety about another man. The psychological pressure was no longer on me, it was on her as the walls of her fabricated reality began to close in. The status threat had turned. It was no longer about my loss of standing, but about her fear of being associated with another failure. She was terrified of going through 2008 again, and she was looking for a way out. I saw her look at our modest living room, then at me. "We should have listened to you back then," she said, a small, manipulative attempt at a peace offering. "It was too little, too late." I realized that she wasn't apologizing for her behavior. She was mourning the loss of the safety she thought Peter provided. I felt a surge of quiet power. I was the only one in the room who wasn't afraid. I began to prepare for the final phase. I had the legal documents ready, not just for a divorce, but for a complete separation of our lives. I had the evidence of her infidelity, the record of my own quiet growth, and a clear path forward. But I wasn't going to move yet. I was waiting for her to speak first. I wanted her to be the one to end it, to prove once and for all that her love was conditional on the environment, not the person. I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the money or the status. It was the moral clarity of knowing exactly who I was and who she wasn't. The cliffhanger came on a Sunday morning. I was reading the paper when a courier arrived with a package. It was a formal notice of a lawsuit against Peter Lawson's firm, naming several close associates in a discovery motion. Rebecca's face went pale as she saw the name on the envelope. She looked at me, her hands trembling. "Thomas, I think I'd made a mistake," she whispered. I didn't look up from the paper. I stayed silent, the clock on the wall ticking away the final seconds of our marriage. I realized the moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived, but it didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like an ending that had been written a long time ago. Section 7. She spoke about my comeback like it was ours. The news of my return to the top didn't leak out in a press release. It moved through the upper echelons of Manhattan like a low-frequency vibration. Suddenly, the phone in my modest home began to ring at odd hours. Names from the past, men who hadn't looked me in the eye for half a decade, were calling to catch up and reconnect. I watched Rebecca observe this shift with a calculated intensity. The coldness that had defined her for years began to melt, replaced by a performative warmth that felt more transactional than her previous disdain. I realized that she was recalibrating her position, trying to find a way to claim a stake in a victory she had spent years betting against. I stayed silent because I wanted to see the mechanics of her pivot. One evening, she prepared a dinner that reminded me of our life before the crash. She had spent a fortune on ingredients we couldn't afford a month ago. She sat across from me, her eyes bright with a terrifying kind of hope. "I heard about the institutional fund, Thomas. Everyone is talking about your strategy," she said, her voice dripping with a pride that didn't belong to her. She spoke about our difficult years and how we had finally made it through the woods. I realized then that she was rewriting history in real time, airbrushing out the nights she had spent in Peter Lawson's shadow. The internal monologue in my head was a cold assessment of the theater. I felt like a judge watching a defendant lie under oath while holding the evidence in my hand. I stayed silent because any correction would have ended the performance too early. I wanted to see how far she would go to re-enter the fortress I had built without her. She started talking about the new house we should look at and how she had already scouted a few properties in Greenwich. It was a fascinating display of psychological resilience, though not the kind I admired. She was a survivor, yes, but only of the circumstances she couldn't control. The psychological pressure was now entirely on her to maintain the illusion of the supportive wife. I watched her struggle to reconcile her past actions with her current narrative. She became hyper-attentive, asking about my day and offering to help with the social side of my new venture. I realized that she saw my success as a collective asset, a reward for her patience during my period of failure. The irony was suffocating. The very man she had called a nobody was now the only thing keeping her from social extinction as Peter Lawson's empire continued to bleed out in public. I stayed silent during the social events where she tried to re-establish our presence. We attended a gala where the power shift was undeniable. People who had ignored me for years were now lining up to shake my hand. Rebecca stood by my side, her hand on my arm, nodding as if she had been the architect of my endurance. I felt the weight of her touch, and it felt like a lead shackle. I realized that the more she leaned into my success, the more I felt the need to pull away. The status she was so desperate to regain was the very thing that had exposed the emptiness of our bond. The social imbalance was now a weapon I held but chose not to use. I saw Evan Marshall across the room, looking gray and diminished. His firm had been caught on the wrong side of the very volatility I had mastered. He approached us, his smile forced and shaky. "You played the long game, Tom. I have to hand it to you," he muttered. Rebecca chimed in before I could speak, her voice sharp and triumphant. "Thomas always knew what he was doing," she said. I looked at her and felt a profound sense of nausea. She was using my competence to settle her own scores with the people who had looked down on her when I was down. I realized that my success had become a mirror for everyone else's insecurities. For Rebecca, it was a way to erase her shame. For Evan, it was a reminder of his own decline. But for me, it was simply the result of discipline and timing. I didn't feel the need to gloat or to punish. I stayed silent because the silence was where my power lived. The pressure at home was building toward a final confrontation, even as Rebecca tried to smother it with expensive wine and talk of our bright future. She was building a house on a foundation she had already destroyed, and I was just waiting for the right moment to point out the cracks. The status threat had moved from me to her. She knew that her position was entirely dependent on my willingness to keep her in the frame. I saw the fear in her eyes when I stayed late at the office, or when I didn't respond to her texts immediately. She was no longer the one with the leverage. She was a supplicant dressed in the clothes of a queen. I realized that she was terrified that I would treat her the way she had treated me when the bank account was empty. I didn't have the heart for that kind of cruelty, but I didn't have the heart for that kind of truth. One night, she brought up the topic of our new beginning. She spoke about renewing our vows and taking a long trip to Europe, just the two of us. It was a desperate attempt to seal the cracks in our history with a coat of luxury. I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I broke the silence. I asked her if she thought money changed the terms of a contract, or just the people who signed it. She went still, the color draining from her face. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked. I stayed silent, letting the question hang in the air like a heavy curtain. The cliffhanger wasn't about the money or the career. It was about the final reveal of the ledger. I walked over to my desk and pulled out the legal folder I had found on the table a year ago, the one she thought I had never seen. I also pulled out the evidence of her hotel bookings from the months when I was failing. I laid them on the table between us, next to the bottle of expensive wine she had opened. I realized that the quiet power shift was finally complete. The look on her face wasn't one of guilt, but of a woman who had finally realized that the man she thought she was managing had been measuring her the entire time. Section 8. What Remains When Love Was Conditional. The silence that followed the revelation of the documents was the most honest moment of our entire marriage. There was no screaming, no dramatic denials, and no tears. Rebecca sat there, staring at the evidence of her own exit strategy, and I saw her finally drop the mask. She didn't look like a socialite or a supportive wife anymore. She looked like a gambler who had finally run out of chips. I realized that she wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry that I had been the one to survive while she had bet against me. The moral clarity of that moment was worth more than every dollar I had clawed back from the market. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to negotiate. The terms of our relationship had been revealed during the lean years, and the current wealth was irrelevant to the verdict. I told her, calmly and without anger, that the house would be sold and the assets would be divided according to the law, not the new life she had envisioned. She tried to argue, to mention the years of support she had given me, but the words died in the air. We both knew the truth. She had stayed only as long as she thought there was a chance of a payout, and she had looked for a replacement the moment the risk became too high. The internal monologue in my head was one of profound relief. I had earned my dignity back, not by getting rich, but by refusing to be defined by her lack of faith. I realized that the 2008 crisis had been a gift. It had stripped away the superficial layers of my life and shown me the rot underneath. I had rebuilt myself with better materials. I was no longer a man who needed a pedestal to feel tall. I stayed silent as she packed her things, the same way she had packed for her gallery trips. But this time, there was no secret smile on her face. She was leaving a man she finally understood, but too late to matter. The psychological pressure had evaporated, replaced by a cool, steady peace. I moved into a smaller, more refined apartment in the city, not because I had to, but because I wanted a space that hadn't been touched by the ghost of our failure. I continued to grow my firm, focusing on the long-term stability that had served me so well. I saw Peter Lawson in the news a few months later. His firm had collapsed, and he was facing a series of investigations. I didn't feel joy at his downfall, only a quiet confirmation of the law of gravity. You can only ignore reality for so long before it demands payment in full. Success, I realized, is a quiet thing when it's earned with integrity. I didn't need the gala invites or the public validation. I spent my evenings reading, working, and occasionally meeting with people like Michelle Grant, who had seen me when I was invisible. I found that I valued competence and character far more than the status I had once chased. The social imbalance had resolved itself naturally. The people who mattered knew who I was, and the people who didn't were no longer my concern. I had achieved the silent dominance that comes from knowing you can survive the worst the world has to throw at you. Rebecca reached out one last time, months after the divorce was finalized. She sent a message talking about regret and timing, hinting that perhaps we had both changed. I didn't reply. I stayed silent because some things are better left in the past. I realized that her regret wasn't for the loss of me, but for the loss of the life I now led without her. I was no longer a risk to be managed. I was a reality she could no longer afford. I felt a quiet satisfaction in that realization. I had won the only war that mattered, the one for my own self-respect. The final moral closure came on a rainy Tuesday, exactly like the one where my life had first collapsed. I was standing in my new office, looking out at the city I had once thought I lost. I felt a sense of power that was restrained and dignified. I wasn't the man I was in 2007, and I certainly wasn't the man I was in 2008. I was someone new, someone forged in the silence of endurance. I realized that money is just a tool, but dignity is the architect. I had lost everything, only to find that everything I truly needed was still there when the smoke cleared. I looked at a photo of myself from the old days, the successful Thomas Caldwell. He looked anxious, even then, as if he knew the foundation was made of sand. I looked at my reflection in the window now. I saw a man who was calm, patient, and utterly settled. I had earned my place in the world again, but this time the terms were mine. The story wasn't about the crash or the comeback, it was about the silence between the two. I picked up my coat and walked out into the rain, not rushing, not hiding, just moving forward at my own pace. The house in Greenwich was sold to a young couple who looked at it with the same wide-eyed hope I once had. I hoped they would be luckier, or perhaps just wiser. As for me, I had no desire to go back. I had learned that the only thing more dangerous than losing everything is keeping something that isn't real. I was free of the conditional love, the status threats, and the loud failures of the past. I was living a life of my own making, and for the first time in 40 years, the air in the room felt exactly right. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't a loud roar of revenge. It was the simple, steady hum of a life well lived and a dignity hard won. I had stayed silent when it mattered, and now the silence was my friend. I walked through the city, a man among millions, but a man who knew exactly where he stood. The year 2008 hadn't been the end of my story, it had just been the end of the prologue. The real narrative had begun the moment I stopped asking for permission to be successful and started building a world that didn't require anyone else's applause. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.